is Tamar. Today we're going to be talking about the history, the evolution of both the hunting horn and its calls. This is a project I've been working on for over 5 years now, and I thought that it would be a very long project that would take up a lot of video time. Sadly, that's not the case. We actually don't have a lot of information that we can say it points us to a real answer that I was looking for. I was looking for, this is what a horn call was, and this is how it was sounded. We don't have that information, so a lot of it is looking at the historical text, pulling out nuggets from them. We don't have any text of just horn blowing. We do have a lot of text to look at for hunting, the art of the game, things like that, that we can pull pieces out, but they're not focused on horn blowing. But they do talk about the importance of horn blowing. So we're going to cover all of that in this video. To start with, we need to understand that the horns have an evolution. So we have what's called a natural horn. A natural horn is something that is found in nature that we can buzz into and make a sound through it. And a lot of people think of the conch shells that we use in the South Pacific. We see that all the time. Any other seashell where you get that conical shape that we can be able to blow. Cow horns, which is what we know of for hunting horns, this is a natural horn. It's a natural object. All we've done is put a hole in the end so that we can use it as a mouthpiece to blow and make sound. So this is something found in nature. It's natural horn, something that we had. Technically, you could take a log that's been hollowed out that you could buzz your lips into. That would be a natural horn, but it's not what we think of as natural horn, but it does fit that definition. So a hunting horn that is a natural horn made out of cow is going to sound different depending on who's playing it. So we're not talking about trying to get different pitches. We're talking about just short and long bursts, so there's not a lot of technique that can be done with this. Even in the text, they talk about a good horn blower can get consistent sound, but not necessarily talking about different pitches. But a natural horn is going to sound something like this. That's a rather loose blowing. If I tighten my lips as the trumpet player that I am, that's another sound. So I can get those two pitches out of it, but I really don't have any leeway in between that lower note and that higher one. And it's hard for me to sustain the lower note because I'm a trained trumpet player. I really try and keep that embouchure nice and tight. So for me, it goes against everything I've been learning to do, and the higher note is much easier, more natural for me. So that is our natural horn. This is what the hunting horn for most of the medieval period was. Now, as time moved on, we had metal became a little bit easier for access for people, and we started getting things like metal mouthpieces. This here is a trumpet mouthpiece, and these could actually, instead of using a hole in the end of the horn, you would cut the hole, but then you would put the mouthpiece in like this, and this mouthpiece gives you a wider range of being able to carry out different notes. This isn't something that we see until a much later period. We're looking at shortly after 1400 that we start to see metal mouthpieces being introduced. Not everybody would have had these. Remember, metal is quite a valuable resource and used for a lot of other things. So this mouthpiece allows me to be able to have a lot more control over the different pitches. Now we're going to take the next step. So one thing that happened was the Romans used a lot of rolled metal tubes with mouthpieces for military purposes and for making those war horns and calls. We know the Celts using the Carniacs, right? The Germanic tribes, the Celtic tribes. And that was the same concept. They had a metal mouthpiece, long metal tube. The fall of Rome, we lost a lot of technology and information. And part of that was the technique of making rolled metal tubes. So it doesn't come back around until the middle of the 1400s that we start getting that coming back. And what that allows us to do is to have a little bit more control, a little bit more pitch change. And we get these longer rolled tubes, right? This is a straight heraldic trumpet. This would be the next step in evolution, where we have this one, the mouthpiece is actually welded on. but it could also be a separate mouthpiece like this that was now stuck in the end of a metal tube. Didn't have to be part of the same. This one in particular is just all one piece, all right? And with this, I can get different pitches a lot easier. Not bad. A lot more control, a little more style. Now we can start to think of this as something that's used more maybe in music than just for hunting or just for military calls. We don't have a lot of evidence of anything being used for military calls when it comes to the hunting horn, the cow horn. We always think of the trumpets of war, and a lot of that is because of our Roman heritage for a lot of what we do. So this was a big game changer, having this rolled metal tube that allowed all those different pitches. Now we have more options in our horn calls, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were used. Remember, change was very slow back then too. Ideas had to spread. Technology had to spread. So these were still used primarily in the same way as the hunting horns, but people started thinking about other ways of using these, and we get into more ceremonial use with these. Now the next step is to do what we call folded trumpet, and what we know of today as the bugle. So the problem is that these horns could get very long. They could get 9+ feet. So what we did is you take that 9 feet and you coil it. Now it's easier to grab. I'm going to put that mouthpiece right in there. With this being easier for me to grab, easier for me to carry, I can take this anywhere much easier to be able to use. But I have the same amount of control over the different pitches and tones that I had with the straight horn. It's just that it's more compact and easier to travel with. All right, so same functionality as our straight trumpet, however, much more user-friendly, much easier to carry, and this is what we tend to see more and more of in use for military purposes as well. Now, we do see there are a couple of manuscripts that have illuminations that start to show metal horns in a big loop, what we think of as the old French horn, right? It's just a metal loop in a big circle with a bell on one end and the mouthpiece on the other, and that comes out in the 1400s. But once again, it's not widespread yet because metalworking is still something that's very valuable and most often used for war or for machinery that was deemed much more important. So the transition from going from a natural horn, hunting horn, to a musical instrument was something that happened very slow over time, and the Germans weren't too fond of the hunting horn. They just considered it a noisemaker. It took a while to catch on. All of my studies that I've been looking into for the past 5 years has really shown what I did not expect was that a lot of the hunting horn traditions and calls began in France. And then from France, it spread over to England, all right, from there. That's not too surprising, right? We know that once William the Conqueror invaded England, everyone wanted to become French. They wanted to be part of that noble elite from Normandy. So a lot of French practices and culture were brought over, and that relationship maintained for a long time, right up through the 100 Years' War. As much as Henry V was invading and conquering, that was because they viewed themselves as the same people, and he wanted the rights for the throne for France. So a lot of the cultural ideas were very similar. So the fact that hunting tradition and hunting horn calls took off in England is not that big of a surprise. We do see that in a lot of manuscripts that it went from France to Britain, and then the Germans, even though they're right next door, really didn't take on to it. I'm not exactly sure why. They had a very strong tradition of using the Carniacs for ceremonial purposes as well as to terrify the Romans, but they viewed them primarily as something that was a noisemaker, not very musical. So we do have reference to the first time that these are used as music instruments for music, and that is an opera that was written. I gotta check my notes here, make sure I got it right. 1633 was the first composition in an opera that used horns, and it was just a loud blast of horns being used. The title of the opera is Ermina sul Giordano, It's not an opera that I'm familiar with, but I'll have to look it up now. But 1633, that is the first time that we actually have horns or trumpet-like instruments being used as an instrument, not just something to make calls. So now that we've talked about a brief overview history of the horn and its evolution and different ways that it was used throughout history, we get into more of the technical knowledge that I was able to glean. As I said, this has been a 5-year project, and the amount of information has been surprising and yet also disappointing. We don't have anything that is like a Rosetta Stone that says this is what this symbol meant, this is what that symbol meant. There's nothing to clue us in, or as some people say, break the code of what these written horn calls actually would sound like. We can make educated guesses, but we cannot say for certain this is what it sounded like. And if anyone says that they can, I'm very skeptical of that. All of my research so far has shown that that is not the case. We are close, but part of it is that our modern understanding of musical notation and how we perceive things is different from the way that things were taught. Remember, everything was taught orally and in person, so they didn't necessarily have things written down. The ones that we do, we have to assume were made for someone that had been teaching this or wanted to make sure that it was passed down. So it wasn't exactly something that the common person would be using. A lot of this was for nobility, for their hunts as a sport, not just for the necessity of hunting. And we have to keep that in mind too, that this was very much a sport. This was very much showing prowess. The idea of hunting then is very different from what we do now. You had hunting as the sport to show your own qualities, to show your worth and your prowess, versus hunting where you're trying to provide food for the castle or for the farm. So very different approaches, and a lot of these horn calls that we're looking at are really written for the sporting aspect of it, where it was an event, something that nobility was taking part in. You're also going to have differences in the way that things were written and passed on for knowledge from region to region. Not everybody thinks the same way. Not everyone has the same language. And that also comes down to our written text, right? We didn't have a standardized notation of exactly how music was written, let alone horn calls. So different areas would have different ways of explaining what they were trying to pass on for knowledge. And that meant that they were writing down horn calls in a way that made sense to them or that they were taught and passing that on. But it wasn't something that they wrote down and said, this means this. It was, this is how you play the call. And they're assuming a base level of knowledge that we no longer have. We don't have that Rosetta Stone. We don't have that documentation that shows us this is what this actually meant. We can make guesses, and there are several different varieties of notations that we have written examples of. So part of it is understanding the concepts of how they broke down their horn calls. And one of the things that they refer to is winds or winds, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It's W-I-N-D-E-S, so you can pronounce it either way. I'd be curious to know if there was a proper way, but I have not been able to find a definitive which way it's supposed to go. Once again, I think that's a difference between French manuscripts and English manuscripts. Now, the winds or the winds were thought of as phrases, right? So it's one of those things where you have a phrase and you're going to repeat that. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to repeat that same phrase over and over and over. So sometimes we see in documentation where it's you're going to blow this phrase, this wind, followed by a short wind, followed by a long wind. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same one over and over, just sped up or slowed down. It could be that you're going to have a wind for one call, and then you're going to have a separate phrase, a separate wind played next that sounds very different, and then bring the first wind back, or it could be a third phrase. They got very intricate with how they were able to put these winds together. So it's very difficult for us to be able to say, you know, this is what it's going to sound like overall. It's almost like using the winds was a way of using vocabulary and grammar, right? We know how to spell something, but then how we use those words we spelled and put them into phrases to make a cohesive statement or concept is going to change from culture to culture, right? When you're speaking French, you put your vowels and your identifications in separate manners than we do with the English. With English, we're used to, this is what it is, and as far as verb versus noun, this is the order things go in. Very different from the French. They put their sentence in a different order. In the end, it means the same thing, but it's a different order of process to get to that point, that information being relayed. And horn calls are very similar to that. We don't know for certain exactly how those whines, those phrases were put together. But the fact that we have whines, the fact that we have these phrases, means that they did have a sophisticated horn call language, something that everyone within that region, that area, would understand and be able to piece together to understand what was going on and what the call meant. So it leads us to understand that we do have a sophisticated horn call language, even though we no longer have the primer or that Rosetta Stone to understand that language. So whines and phrases can be very helpful, breaking things down into smaller chunks to understand them. But once again, we still don't understand the minutia of inside those, what those mean or how they were actually called. Outside of the whines, when you have a number of whines put together to create a call, they would call that a strake. So a strake meant the entire call. So when I'm doing horn calls and creating them, I'm focusing on my whines, my phrases, and then I'm going to repeat that a certain number of times to create my strake, my overall horn call. That's the beginning and end of the entire message. Basically, if you would, it's your paragraph, right? If we think of our whines or our wins as our sentences, think of the strake or the horn call as the paragraph, right? It's an easier way to kind of visualize what they were doing and how they understood it. Going into notation, we have a very difficult time with notation. There are multiple different ways that they had of notating between regions. Now, keep in mind that standardized music notation with staffs that we understand today did not start coming around until the middle of the 1400s. And it took a while for it to spread. Once it did, then we had a standardized notation. Then we have a way to communicate ideas, musical concepts from region to region and spread much farther because it's easier to transport as written knowledge being passed on. But we don't have that for much of our period that we're looking at. A lot of the manuscripts that I was able to find are from 1327 up to 1591. A lot of our understanding of horn calls really comes after our SCA period of 1600. A lot of our understanding really blossoms in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when it became part of the English fox hunting culture, which still goes today. They still use the foxhorn, the fox hunt calls. So it's very interesting to see that had still progressed, and as it became something more and more of a sport, the nobility did to show off and prove themselves to each other and to the royalty, that's when we get these more and more sophisticated calls that are still being used today. But we can't trace today's calls back and say this is where they come from. We don't have that missing link of direct translation for calls being used today. But the concept of using the calls, that goes way back. We know that. So it's one of those interesting things where we know a lot about it during the Victorian period. A lot of assumptions were made incorrectly without direct documentation. Our direct documentation shows a variety of ways of communicating these ideas. And that's where we really run into problems. I was really hoping when I started this project 5 years ago that it would be something where I could say, this was the call that meant, found the game. And it's going to sound like this. And what I found is that I can't do that. I can show you notations for different calls that were written down, but I cannot translate what those notations actually were. Some of these notations are very interesting and very difficult in order to try and understand. One of the most enigmatic ones that I've had to deal with is a series of woodcuts. So these are some woodcuts that were done, and they're nothing more than a black square, a white square, a space, a white square, a black square. So it's very difficult to be able to understand what those were. Did the black square mean that was a short note, and the white square meant it was a long note, and then the break in between was a space, that was a pause? Or was there something else going on in that? Was the black square a long note, and the white square was a short note with pauses in between? We have no way of being able to say what that would sound like, what that would do. So one of the issues we have without that Rosetta Stone, we don't have that reference point, right? And I've never seen anything as far as musical notation that looked back that showed woodcuts like this. It's very intriguing, very interesting, and it's so different from anything else I've seen that even comes close to musical notation. So while it seems, pardon the pun, very black and white, it's anything but. We really don't understand what it is, but it's very intriguing to look at. It was obviously something that was very simple for them to pass on, and as a woodcut, it's very durable, right? It's not paper that can get wet or destroyed as easily. A woodcut is going to last much longer and can be replicated very easy to pass on. So it was a great way to transmit the information if we had that primer, that source that said, this is what it means. So one of those, the woodcuts, I want to try and get this correct here. So it is from a manuscript from Hodouin de Fontaines-Guérin's Hunting Treatise, Le Livre du Trésor de Venere, and that was 1394. Don't worry, I'll have this in writing that you can look at and link because I can't pronounce the French very well. But it's fascinating to know that he had over 14 of these calls in this one manuscript that he had written because these were something that they wanted passed on to be preserved. So, we're looking at the 1300s, they're using woodcuts, black squares, white squares. Straightforward, but without the primer, I can't really be definitive on what it means. Another one is one that looks very similar to what I think of as cursive writing. It's like a combination of cursive writing and almost a musical notation. We're dealing with little circles with a line drawn like a rainbow over it. Some of them are circles with a dot over it. And some of them are just a line, a slash. So it's one of those things where what does that dot over the circle mean? Is the circle a whole note, like a long note? Is it a short note? I'm not seeing a difference between the circles. It's not like one circle is filled in and one circle is left open. We are seeing the circle drawn over the rainbow being drawn over the circle. Does that mean that's the long note? And the ones with the dot over top are a short note? Possibly. But there are also circles that don't have the rainbow or the dot. So what does that mean? I don't know. The slash could very well mean that it is a rest. One of the only definitive answers that we have was from a manuscript found at Yale that they are still looking into and investigating about where it came from and how accurate it is, where it shows a line and the notation in it, and I believe it is in French. It's very hard for me to read the cursive writing that is under it. Says, this is a rest. So I can pretty confidently say that that slash in that manuscript, that is a rest. That's a pause in between phrases or in between notes. That is the only definitive piece that we know anything about for any of the horn calls that are written in period. And on these horn calls, because they're written so differently from region to region, we refer to it as horn tablature. Okay, it's not music, it's not sheet music, notations like that. We call it horn tablature because it was a way for that area to understand specifically horn calls. We haven't found this kind of notation used for anything other than horn calls. So it's pretty safe to call it horn tablature. That way we understand that this was something written and created just for transmitting the idea of how to play the horn, how to play those calls. In that same one that we're just talking about, there is also a bracket where it's a line up, a line over, and a line down. Almost like it's tying two things together, but it's very square, and there's nothing in between. there's something before and after, but the bracket isn't going up above anything as like this is a group. So once again, what does that mean? Is that a long rest where it's supposed to be two individual rests with a line joining them over saying that it's going to be two rests together? But it looks like one big square rather than three individual items. But that could also be the fact that the scribe was writing things very quickly. We all know how dirty cursive writing can get because we get writing so fast that we just connect one thing to the next to the next. This could be an example of that. We don't know. That's one of the fun parts about this is the different ways that people were able to write things, and you have to remember that it's a human being writing this. Could they have gotten lazy? Could they have been trying to save ink? Even in modern music, we find so many times when musical notation is written in a way that doesn't make sense. When, why didn't you just write this phrase out rather than this weird looking symbol over here? Well, they're saving ink. They're saving paper space. That's a consideration too. We don't know how much of this was trying to shorthand things to try and get the ideas down without expanding on the entire tablature. We simply don't know. Another fun facet, another rabbit hole, and I still haven't found the bottom of that rabbit hole. I don't know if there is any more information I can get from that. I've been looking at numerous sites, and there's just not enough information to really try and get a hold of that and say this is what this most likely means. As I said, that rest, that is the only thing that we can point to and say we know what that is. That system of notation is shown in a piece written by Gasquian. There will be plenty of footnotes in the document at the end of this that will show you where these original sources are with the authors' names on them, because I want people to be able to look at this and go back and see if they can find the answers too. This is a project near and dear to my heart as a trumpet player, and I by no means am able to read every untranslated text. I'm terrible at multiple languages. I'm depending on other people's translations of text to understand what things mean, so I welcome any new ideas. The other one that we have is much closer to what we understand for standard musical notations. We have a staff, we have the notes on the staff. However, it doesn't really give us enough information to be able to say this is what it is. It's the closest we've come. And by that, I mean we have what looks like 4/8 notes, 3/8 notes, and a half note with a dotted beat. So that would be 3 beats. All right. So when it's written out like that, we're not actually seeing 4, then 3 notes, then the long note. In our understanding of today's modern music, that would simply be 7 notes and a long note, with no change in between. There's no dots, there's no rest, there's nothing in there to indicate breaks in that phrase. So it would simply be 7 short notes followed by a longer note. But that's probably not what it was, because right after that in the notation, we see brackets of 2 short notes, followed by 2 short notes, followed by 3 short notes, followed by 4 short notes, and then back to 2 short notes, right? They're bracketed together as 8th notes as those pairs or those triplets or those quadruplets. So I think, and it's probably safe to assume, that they were seen as individual phrases with a slight pause in between those, but once again, we cannot say definitively that's what it was. If I were simply to play it out as written, as understanding our modern musical notation system, there'd be no difference. Every single note would just be the exact same time length, exact same, with no change. There's no rhythmic change. It's bump, 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 ba. That's not very different, right? So trying to get those different notations out there, doesn't really understand it. It's hard to be able to look at it and say, okay, this is what it's going to be. It would make more sense to look at it and say, okay, they're talking about groupings. So they're going to do 4 notes, 3 notes, and a long note. So ba 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 ba. That's what that might have sounded like, rather than our straight interpretation, which would just be the 7 straight notes and a long. Multiple ways of looking at the same piece of tablature and trying to figure out what they were trying to portray as the original goal. Without that Rosetta Stone, we don't have any way of knowing for sure. We do have some more accurate descriptions where it's not horn tablature, it's not a written system of music to be able to pass on, it is phonetic. And by that I mean there are descriptions of what a call should sound like as far as using syllables. And there is an example of that. Let's pull this out correctly here. So in the Treatise of the Art of Hunting with William Twitty, he does go through and he talks about different calls being trout and ta-ra-ra-rout. So you could, one of the calls that he has in here that you can pull out is, it would be a ta-ra-ra-rout, trout, trout, ta-ra-rout, ta-ra-rout, trout, trout, ta-ra-ra-ra-ra-ra-ra-ra-rout. That's a little bit easier to understand because you're phonetically sounding out what it would sound like. It's not a tablature because it's not a symbolic system. We're not using symbols or icons to be able to show what that is, but it is a way to describe to someone who doesn't know that system what it's supposed to sound like. Now, when he's doing the trow and the trow, row, row, rout, it could be that he's vibrating that note. So that when you get your call, you're getting that single blast of the trout, and then you're getting trow, row, 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 and we can do that with the trumpet, right? It's a little bit difficult with the horn, cow horn, but it can be done. But with the trumpet, it would sound a little bit more like this. So you're almost getting multiple notes out of it, but what you're doing is you're just quavering that one note. Is that what he means by the ta-ra-ra-ra-ra-ra-rout? Or is he using that second phrase to talk about the length of the note and saying you're going to hold that note while you say this in your head so that you know that, okay, ta-ra-ra-ra-ra-ra-rout, that was the length of that note? We don't know. So the phonetic gets us much closer to understanding what it was, but we're still not there. We still don't have that definitive, this is what it sounded like. So multiple ways of, being able to play with that. Did we have those quavering notes? Was it just a long blast? Now we know in modern fox calls for hunting in England, they are using that quavering tone. Was that something that they did from interpreting Twitty's writings? Or was it something that was just passed down over time orally as people understood it? And they're picking up on those traditions. Once again, without the documentation, we don't have a way of knowing that. Especially because a lot of these fox calls were widely spread and developed more in the Victorian era, and we all know how unreliable the Victorians were with actually portraying history correctly. So we don't have that foundation to be able to say, this is what it sounded like. But phonetics, I feel, is one of the most accurate ways that we would be able to understand what a horn call actually would have sounded like. It's something that transcends culture and region, so it's very easy to transmit, oh, this is what it sounds like. So multiple ways of being able to transmit the idea of what a horn call should sound like. I wish we had a Rosetta Stone. I'd love to be able to sit down and go, okay, this is what this sounded like, this is what that one sounded like. But the one thing that seems to be across all of the horn calls is that none of them talk about different pitches, different notes. They talk about overtones and undertones, which can be your lower pitches and your higher pitches. But a lot of times that the way that those references were written could have been talking about one horn sounded lower and one horn sounded higher. Were you using two different horns? That's a possibility. Was it that you had two people on the hunt and they were alternating calls back and forth depending on the pitch of their horn? It's a possibility, it's not likely. But once again, we don't have a way of saying that's what it was. So it's really kind of aggravating and frustrating after years of research not to have that answer. It's not the answer I wanted. But I did learn a lot looking through this about hunting culture, the way that ideas were transmitted musically and orally and written. So many things to go through, so much information out there, but it's in bits and pieces, and it doesn't have that overall unifying Rosetta Stone. It's going to bring everything together. So now we've talked a little bit about the minutia of, how do we transmit the idea, how do we record it, how did they try and pass that knowledge on, what did it sound like. The last piece of this puzzle is, how did they use the horn calls? What was the purpose of these calls? Being that these are for hunting, this is not for war, right? In war, we're going to be using something that was much more similar to this. And in war, you're not trying to have everybody understand what your call would mean. You want your people to know what the call would mean, but you don't want the enemy to also know what your calls mean. You don't want them to know that you're calling a retreat or that you're calling to go to the right flank or the left flank. You don't want them to know that. So a lot of military calls, I haven't seen very much evidence of them as far as being written down. I'd love to dig into some Roman texts and see if there's anything further in there about what these calls might have sounded like, because all of that was kept very close to the chest. You didn't want your opponents to understand what was happening in real time in a battle. Hunting calls, that's not the case. Hunting calls, we want everybody to know what's going on, because the point of the hunting call is to communicate to everybody in the area what's happening. And a lot of these calls were geared for trying to track down game, identify the game, and then tell us which direction the game is going, or did we get the game. So all of these calls were focused on those concepts of communication. There are different calls for, we found a deer, we found a boar, we found pheasant. You're communicating what it is you found over a long distance. The master of the hunt would hear the calls, would interpret where do we want to go, what game do we want to go after, and then they would make their decision from there, from those people out in the field communicating back of what they found. A lot of times it would be, the deer or the hounds are going east, going north, letting them know which direction you're now moving, so that the master of the hunt can say, okay, you guys are going to go off this way to try and corner the animal that way. Especially with a group of people that know their own landscape as well as they did, they can make decisions ahead of time. If they're going north, oh, there's a pass right there, we know exactly where that animal is trying to get through. We're going to send men there ahead of time to ambush them there. So hunting was very different from what we do now. There's no deer stands hiding in trees with a bow and arrow for days on end hoping that that deer comes back so you can take it out. It was a very active engagement where the constant communication, constant decisions being made. One of the most important is that the hounds have called, saying that basically the hounds have a scent of an unknown creature. So the hounds are onto something, we're tracking it, they don't know what it is yet. And then eventually, hopefully they can call back whether they found scat or they found hair or something that would identify what the animal is that the hounds are tracking. Then they can communicate back, this is what it is. But until then, they're going to actively pursue that unknown prey in hopes that it's a bigger game that they're looking for. So that is a call that is actually very well documented as far as being used throughout many different regions, many different cultures, especially in the French and English areas. It's that unknown game. We have something, we're going to go find it, we're going this direction. So that's something that almost every manuscript had a version of that call that was written down in horn tablature. Another one is, success, or the stag is down. A lot of times they would call that a prize. All right, we've gotten the prize. We met our goal. What that tells all the other hunters is, if that was your end goal, was to get that game, okay, we're all done now. Now we're going to all come back either to that area where they've got that animal down to the ground, or, okay, we're done, everybody back to the castle or to the manor for the rest of the day. Now we're going to celebrate the successful hunt. But it gets everyone back out of the field. They know that, okay, we're done, it's time to come back. So those were different ways that horn calls were used in period that we can document. I'm sure that there are many more that we don't have reference for, keeping in mind that a lot of these manuscripts, we're pulling out bits and pieces here and there. It's by no means a complete picture or a complete encyclopedia of these are all the calls, these are all the things we're trying to communicate. So it's much like paleontology, right? We make a lot of assumptions about the fossil record from what we can see in the ground, but who's to say that that's, all the dinosaurs there were? We know we're still finding new species every day. Well, it's the same thing with these horn calls. We don't know that everything out there was written down in these tablatures. Have we found all the tablatures?
There are some documents at Yale that I found that don't have an author and they don't have a date, and they're listed as unpublished. They don't know where they came from to be able to validate them. And some of them have the same musical notation, and some of them have a few different notations, but they're very leery to put that out to the public as far as this is what it is yet, because they don't know yet. They're still trying to research. So we're still finding new information, but there isn't really a lot out there. And without that encyclopedia of saying, you know, this is everything about horns, we don't really have a central place to put that information. And most of my 5 years of research has been trying to pull these little nuggets out from here and there, not getting the answer I wanted, but gaining a lot of knowledge in the process. And part of my goal for this project was not only to understand what the horn calls were used for, what they sounded like, but to be able to then take that and say, in our game of the SCA, in our Forester Guild, what are things that we need to communicate? How can we apply this period practice to our modern game and understanding of period practices? So that will be the next video, is to actually take what I've learned doing this and being able to create horn calls for the Forester Guild to be able to use. That's kind of like my capstone for this whole thing. I'm really hoping that everything I learned over the past 5 years really will help me create something that's easy for people to understand and easy to teach and pass on. So until then, please enjoy the woods, enjoy the forests, whatever style of hunting or fishing you may enjoy, and I'll see you on the trails.